The Purple Line is a community podcast bringing you in-depth conversations with diverse leaders in the public and private sectors. Whether you're a student looking to gather advice or a professional tuning in for valuable resources, our dynamic programming provides tips for all ages and backgrounds. I'm your host, Keith Fernandez, and this is The Purple Line. Sharlett Mena represents Washington's 29th District in the Washington State House of Representatives. The proud daughter of Mexican immigrants, she is a first-generation Mexican-American and is the first in her family to graduate from college. Sharlett's upbringing in a working-class family informs her perspective and drives her work to empower working families through policy and change. A graduate of Washington State University with degrees in communications and philosophy, Sharlett has over a decade of experience at various levels of government. She began her career in the U.S. House of Representatives as a communications manager and later a communications director. Sharlett is a leader in the Washington State Department of Ecology, where she works with governments and stakeholders to protect clean air and water, implement climate action, and advance environmental justice. Sharlett is a community organizer and co-creator of Voter Turnup, a movement led by people of color to promote voter registration, cultural expression, and civic engagement. In the legislature, she serves as vice chair on the Environment and Energy Committee and on the committees on state government and tribal relations and transportation. Representative Sharlett Mena, thank you for joining us on the Purple Line, CHLI's first ever alumni elected to public office anywhere. Huge deal. So we are incredibly excited to have you on the podcast. I'm excited to see you again. I was really privileged to see you in Olympia when you were sworn in. And first of all, congratulations.
Thank you so much. I'm so proud, and I'm so proud to be a part of the CHLI family too.
Thank you. And I think that diving in right now, March, we're in Women's History Month, and you have really made a lot of history. You've made CHLI history for sure. Tell me, what inspired you to run for office? What inspired you to, maybe being the first CHLI alumni elected to office wasn't a primary motivator, but certainly what made you make the choice to be a voice for your community at the state level?
I really appreciate the question because I think, like a lot of our alumni, I didn't grow up necessarily thinking I should run for office, right? My parents immigrated from Mexico. I grew up in Eastern Washington, where a lot of folks didn't share my political affiliation. But it was through a series of experiences, starting out with my first internship through CHLI at the nation's capital and seeing how the process works and seeing how people make decisions about communities without those communities represented in the room too often. And when I came back home to Washington State, I felt like that continued to happen, whether it was immigration reform at the federal level without immigrant voices in the room when those final decisions were being made, or whether it was issues that affect working families without folks that had lived experience as someone who came from a family that, was having a hard time making ends meet. And so for me, navigating those processes for a while and understanding that that is just as important as some of the other credentials that we hold up, whether it be, the highest school ranking and having an Ivy League degree or having a law degree, and coming into that confidence that our communities, regardless of where you come from, regardless of where you went to school, regardless of how much money you had in your pocket when you got here, deserve to be at the table because those policies affect us too. And that's what really gave me the final push to do that here in South Tacoma.
Awesome. And I know that CHLI, you mentioned CHLI just right now, but was it your first experience interacting with government at that level, being an intern, seeing how policy is made firsthand, or had you been doing that for a bit before that?
That was really my first experience. So I went out to DC right after college through the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, and I worked at an agency, and I started to network with other interns. Some of them were doing CHLI and were doing congressional internships. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't know that members of Congress had staff. I never even thought about that, right? That's how far removed I was from the political process, and where I grew up in Eastern Washington in a really, farming community and farm worker community. So my first day on the job, I remember there was a policy that got people really wound up, the internet companies in particular. And so they had created this grassroots campaign through their websites to get people to call their members of Congress and ask them to change their votes. And I remember the phones ringing off the hook, right? Everybody in the office, all 12 people in the office were answering calls. We had to start keeping tallies. And at the end of the day, the congressman that I was working for changed his vote because the outcry from the constituency was so big. And I had a light bulb moment where I thought, whoa, we can make people can make change. If we organize, we can do anything here. And I was hooked, and I never wanted to do anything else again but work in policy.
So you went back to Washington State, and how did that knowledge from, being in a member of Congress's office, being at an agency in Washington, D.C., catapult you to local involvement and making change at the local level and now state level?
Yeah. So I think seeing all these big policies play out at the federal level was really important. But I felt this tug to come back home and serve my community where I came from more directly. And none of these policies, whether they're local at the city level, at the state level, or at the federal level, are really isolated. And so I think having that federal experience taught me not only how the legislative process works, but how it works in conjunction with the executive branch and how the federal and state government can and should interact, because a lot of these issues are really, legislated or regulated on a continuum from the city level to the federal level. So I think it makes me a much better legislator, a much more informed legislator to have had that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And in your time in the state house, and even before that, being involved in state politics and local politics, what have you found that voters really hone in on? I know that there are a lot of buzzy federal issues, but how do you get them to pay attention to issues that are just as vital to them, by the way? Sometimes, if not more so, because it affects their day to day lives, but might not be dominating the headlines the way things coming out of Washington are.
I think that's a really good question, because what folks read in the news is always about Congress and the administration, and they're rarely reading about what's going on in the state legislature. And it keeps you nice and humble because nobody knows who their state legislators are, except for a few that are very, very plugged in. But I would say that the more local the policy, the more it directly affects you. So I spend a lot of times on the doors talking to constituents, and it's usually the same issues that are happening nationwide. What I heard this year were folks were worried about community safety. They were worried about the housing crisis. They were worried about affordability. And those issues are really important to me in my district, where we're very working class, majority people of color district. And so what I try to explain to folks is where the decisions and policies they care about are being made. And a lot of folks care about, community safety, about how that impacts their kids and how we fund our schools. So I think it's a matter of having that one-on-one conversation and telling them, this is what the state is doing. And if you want to have a meaningful say in that, here's how you do it. You vote, you become civically engaged.
You've seen a lot of sea change in politics, whether it was being a Chile intern, whether it was going back and then running for office and successfully winning, especially in this pandemic to, I guess, emerging out of the pandemic period that we're in. How have voters' priorities changed? Or are we still kind of in the same place where the economy's still, pretty up top, healthcare pretty up top, education pretty up top? Or have we seen sort of a reordering of what voters care about in the wake of this, once in a generation, hopefully, pandemic?
Yeah. Um, I guess it depends. I do think that folks have something that becomes top of mind when they're experiencing it and facing it every day, that becomes maybe their single issue or one of their top issues that they vote on. But when you talk about economics in a district that is one of the lowest income in the entire state of Washington, that is always top of mind. And our housing crisis, where we don't have enough supply, we simply don't. We're 250,000 housing units short across the state, and we have a really growing, booming economic anchor in the city of Seattle that is pushing everybody further and further south into my city. And so these are long-standing issues that people care about. I think as we see things like economic instability rise and we start to see crime rise as a result, those things become top of mind for folks. But in general, there are, I think, anchor kitchen table issues that people continue to bring up.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And as you were running for office and as you speak to constituents now in your capacity, one of the things that I think is sort of an evergreen question is the idea of representation. And you're obviously an accomplished Latina who is a great legislator and is a Latina. And I think that one of the things that is interesting is how do you show up being a Latina while you're legislating, but also legislating for each and every person in your district?
That's a really great question, because this year, you might be happy to know, we have the the biggest, largest number of Latinos that have ever served in the Washington state legislature. And I don't know if I shared this with you, but we were able to form the first ever Latino caucus.
Whoa, that's awesome.
Yeah, we launched that this year. We're 11 strong, and it's really exciting because we're at the biggest numbers we've ever seen, and at the same time we continue to grow as a constituency in the state of Washington. So for me, of course, I'm here to represent my constituency and the folks of the 29th legislative district, but all of the policy we make affects everybody statewide. And so I think there's been a lot of pressure and responsibility happily taken on by members of color, especially Latino members, who feel that they are in fact doing the work and representing Latinos across the state as well as people across the state. And what that means for us is, we have a really large concentrated Latino population in Eastern Washington, where I grew up. Like I said, big farming and farm worker communities. And of course, we have Latino folks across the state of Washington. But for me, that responsibility extends to communicating with folks on all sides of the state and understanding what their needs are and how I can show up for them.
That's incredible. And, sort of looping back to your Chile internship, what leadership lessons did you take from that internship or work, shortly thereafter that have really served as ways to undergird how you approach your work, whether it's representing your constituents, passing a bill, or anything else that you've done to improve your community? What could someone who is 19, 20, 21, current Chile intern or thinking about it, really take from what you learned and extrapolate it to success later on in life?
I appreciate that. So I would say a couple of big things. First, I wouldn't take for granted all of the basic lessons about professionalism that we learned in Chile, right? It is surprising as you get through your career how shaking someone's hand, showing up on time, saying yes, going above and beyond with every assignment that you're giving manifests into success. I mean, it really is that simple. And I'll give you a perfect example. When I was a Chile intern in Congressman Alvio Sides's office, that's where I started. I was probably one of 3 or 4 interns at the time. And when the staff assistant took a different job, a promotion in a different office, I was the first person on their list to interview for that job. And that's where I started my career as a professional in the House of Representatives. And I think if I hadn't been so committed, so dedicated, so on time, so professional, I would not have been number 1 on that list. And this was really the step that launched my career in politics, because as you know, for every job opening, there's hundreds and hundreds of people that want that position. So, be prepared, right? When opportunity meets preparedness, that's when success can happen. And I would say the second thing is truly and really bipartisanship. I was really grateful to work for members that were really committed to doing work and understood that to be successful, it was a good thing to work across the aisle and find common ground. And I'll say, as a legislator, I think it's different work to be a candidate than it is to be a legislator. And when you're a candidate, you should go tell people your values and you tell them what the end goal is and you tell them what is the marker you're reaching for. But when you get there to do the work, the way to inch closer and closer to your goal is to work across the aisle to bring people along and to make progress together.
That's incredible, and I think that's absolutely what Chile has tried to exemplify. Last serious question, because then we'll get into a few fun. We'll get into it. We'll get into a few fun ones.
Yeah.
Last serious question is, you kind of just started your tenure, which is great because all the opportunities in front of you. If you had to think about what your priorities are, and I'm sure you have for the legislative session, how would you define success?
That's a great, great question. So I will say that I built my presence in community through organizing around voting rights and voter expansion and voter enfranchisement. And while I'm working on a lot of environmental issues and spaces where I think we can create opportunity for Latinos to be more present, including on environmental justice, climate change, air quality, water quality, things that really matter. To me, if I get to the other side of my legislative career and I will have made it easier for people like me to run for office and successfully get to office, I will have done what I came for. So I'm continuing to work on that. I passed 6 bills before a cutoff, which I'm really excited about. And one of them is the Washington Voting Rights Act 2.0, which lowers the barrier to access the Washington Voting Rights Act that we already have. It's a really good bill. It creates opportunities for folks to run locally by enabling basically local jurisdictions to switch to district-based rather than at large. And we saw this work successfully in cities like Yakima and Pasco, where changing those structures led to the first Latinos ever being elected to their city councils. And so that's a big step that prepares people to run for the next step. And I think we're ready, right? We're ready for Latino governors and members of Congress.
I can tell you I am ready, and I love that in my hometown of Miami, they switched from at-large to districts, and actually that made a huge impact on Latinos getting elected. So super excited about that. And now the fun questions, which are always the hardest because then it puts you on the spot. But just a little bit, the policy one's easy. The fun ones, you're like, oh my God, I don't know what it could be. But favorite movie?
I have a lot of favorite movies. I don't want to be stereotypical, but Selena's one of my favorite movies of all time.
Oh, that's the best. Okay, but the soundtrack is awesome. So yes,
The
that's
soundtrack, well, the soundtrack is her. Yeah.
yeah.
That's when I fell in love with J-Lo as well.
Oh, I know, and she's still awesome and going strong. Um, let's see. Favorite DC place to go? Monument, restaurant, whatever. Pick a place.
That's a really good question. Um, I don't, so my first place that I lived was on H Street before all of the new remodeling. And so there was basically like two restaurants, and I used to end up at the H Street Country Club all the time. And next door they had this pie place where you would get savory pies and sweet pies, and it was like 2 for $15 on date nights or something. I don't know.
It's still great.
Back to old H Street Northeast.
It's still great though. It's still there. The pie shop. Yeah,
It's still there.
yeah, it's still there, and it's
Oh,
still
that's excellent.
and it's still every kind of pie. They have like ridiculous ones like Rocky Road pie, which is not good for you at all, but tastes delicious.
No, and see, like my congressional staffer mind came out where I was like, and there's good deals.
Yeah, I know. You're like, hey, can I have dinner for $5? That'll be great. All right.
Exactly.
Yes. And then last one is favorite part of your morning routine. Is it getting coffee? Is it reading the paper? Is it something totally different, like maybe walking your dog?
Mm.
What do you look forward to the most when you get up in the morning that does not have to do with serving your constituents?
That's awesome. That's a great question. But since you mentioned it, I think it is my dog in the mornings. He's especially affectionate in the morning. So he crawls up, and then he'll ask me to pet him with his paw. And then as soon as I stop petting him, he starts pawing at me again. And it's just like dogs and kids are a good reminder of why we do what we do, and that all the things that we're wrapped up in, all the things that are in our minds, like maybe are not as big of a deal to everybody else, and maybe the day will go on. So I think having a pet around that is just happy all the time is really something special.
I love it. It's great advice. I'm on the continual journey to get a pet, so you have inspired me yet again. And now I have a Washington State representative endorsing the idea of me getting a pet. Not any
I'm
other
Sharlett
idea.
Mena, and I endorse you getting a pet.
All right. Well, I'm going to take that home with me, and lots of people will be happy. Representative Sharlett Mena, the first CHLI alumni elected to office at any level. We are so honored that you joined us today, and we hope to see you soon in Washington, D.C. If not, we'll all go to the other Washington State.
That sounds great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to The Purple Line. You can follow me at _Keith Fernandez on Twitter, and make sure to follow CHLI across all social media platforms at the CHLI for the latest updates.